Welcome to the Queer Collective podcast. This is our very anticipated Ban vs. Pie.
Ban versus pie. This is our ban versus pies. Do you prefer to
I
eat?
like pie better. Yeah.
I like pie
You know what?
too.
I
I
identify
want to
as
identify
pie.
as pie now. I'm going to
Vans
identify
are
as
really
bisexual.
fun. They're really fun to ride in, unless we're talking about Vans shoes. Welcome to the Queer Collective podcast live stream, our and very anticipated pan versus bi conversation. This is a fun style. This isn't a debate. We're framing this as a debate, but this is really just a conversation that's happened within the community for a while. So we're just having a fun conversation and just nitpicking, and just having fun.
Yes, Anthony and I will be acting as moderators. My name is Ryan. For those who don't know, I run at Alphabet Mafia on TikTok and the Alphabet Mafia brand. And Anthony, why don't you tell me about yourself?
My name is Anthony. I am Token808 on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. My content's kind of not really there right now because I'm a college student, but it's there if you want to see it. And I co-host this podcast with this one right here.
Beautiful. And we have two lovely guests today. We have Mackenzie and Jenna, who will be joining us, both respectively from their sides of the aisle. So Mackenzie, why don't you start with an introduction on yourself?
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I go by Mackenzie online pretty much everywhere, TikTok, Instagram, all the places. I mostly talk about like science and education, but as a pansexual woman, I also think it's important to talk about these sorts of things because, representation is extremely important. We all know. So I do try and be Sorry, I also have little dogs that you might hear running around, and I apologize. But I like to be a pan advocate and make sure that people feel like they are valid in their identity. That's and Jenna and I met because we talk about these things, and that's how we met. So, Jenna, tell us about you.
Yeah, beautiful. So Mackenzie's representing the pan side, and then we have Jenna over here, I assume representing the bi side. Do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Jenna. I go by j.tcake on Instagram and TikTok. I'm a bi educator and influencer, content creator. I mostly focus on dispelling bi stereotypes and providing resources specifically tailored to bi people, just because I noticed a need for that and a gap for that in content that existed already. So I love what I do, and I'm excited to be here with Mackenzie because she's awesome.
Thank you. Well, we're both very excited to have you here. And I think this conversation is going to be very interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, disclaimer before we get started. There's no animosity between anyone in this group chat, this live call. This is for fun. This is just a lovely conversation for us to have. And I'm ready to educate this gay boy because me and Ryan don't know. We don't know shit.
We learn something every
We've said this in our podcast. We're learning here.
The last one was like a therapy session for the both of us. So we're glad to be here.
So educate us and our listeners and viewers as well. You gotta be.
So I guess my first question or my first thought when it comes to this whole pan versus bi debate, air quotes, is how did this discourse even happen? Where did this come from where it even became positioned as a pan versus bi thing? And the floor is open to anyone who wants to answer.
I guess I'll jump in. So the way I remember it, and I mean, I'm 30 years old. I came out when I was 14 in 2004. And so I've been bi for a while, and I was in fact alive when pansexual started becoming popularized as an identity. The word pansexual has been around for a long time. It had different meanings and different forms. It started gaining popularity as like a identity comparative to bisexual, like in like the late 2000s. And I specifically started noticing the discourse happening around 2009 in my experience. I know in 2009 at a college queer group was the first time I introduced myself as bisexual to somebody, and somebody said, "Well, why aren't you pansexual?" And I was like, "I don't know what that means. What are you talking about?" And ever since that moment, ever since more people started hearing about pansexuality and comparing it to bisexuality, which inevitably happens because they're so similar, people started getting confused. And I think with confusion comes, people find this need to make things up to make it less confusing. Like, people just try to make sense of it the best way they can. A lot of weird misinformation started coming out of everybody's confusion and attempt to make sense of the two labels coinciding, and it's just probably been a mess ever since then.
Yeah, I think Jenna said it pretty perfectly, but the big thing is that there was confusion and no education behind that confusion. So like even in queer spaces, right? Like you weren't being told what those meant or how to kind of work around different identities or what, felt comfortable for you. You were kind of like Jenna was like given an identity. She was like, they were like, "Oh, so you are pansexual." And
Mhm.
instead of actually having the conversation about what that means or what feels comfortable to a person. So in that kind of newness of pansexuality, and I say newness because relatively new, bisexuality has been around for quite some time. We're looking over a century at this, more than a century at this point. And pansexuality is in the past like 50-ish years, so it's relatively new, right? And in the newness of it and in maybe again the confusion and people not really understanding and saying things when they don't actually understand, that's another issue, is people speaking up when they don't really know what they're talking about. That becomes a problem, because that was kind of a huge portion of the discourse that has gone on online between bi and pan, came from people posting or saying what they thought pansexuality was, and them defining it for themselves, and then that not being very nice or not being worded very kindly, and then people being like, "Well, see, that person did it, so that's the whole thing. All of you think the same way that this person thinks." and
Yeah.
and that's led to this really weird discourse that has happened between the two identities.
Okay. And so from a pan perspective, I mean, we were talking about definitions and labels and understanding what the definitions of pansexuality or bisexuality actually is. So from a pan person, what is the definition of pansexual?
So I battle with this. I feel like I have a hard time with this because I hate being like the person that's like technically, because that sucks. Like no one wants to be that person, but I am that person that sucks, and I don't want to be that person because I think that you should identify with what makes you feel comfortable, and that's not for me to decide or for me to define for you. So that's why when you're kind of like the jerk that's like technically this is what it means, it kind of sounds so stupid, and I've done it before. I'm not saying that like I've been that person before that has said those things, and I understand. And I think it's come from me from a place of like having such a deep understanding and a lot of history that I've read into of what pansexuality is and what its movement has been about. So when I've spoken about it, I've been so passionate to be like, technically this is this and this, but that's not really for me to define anyways. That's for whoever the person is. So with that being said, with all of that preface being said, I think
Great
that if you're
disclaimer.
looking at pansexuality, disclaimer, when you're looking at pansexuality, a lot of people have used kind of like all fingers are thumbs, not all thumbs are fingers, or fingers not thumbs are fingers, or rectangles are squares, squares are rectangles, kind of analogies where it kind of falls into what bi is. Like bi is two or more, sometimes all, with or without preference, and pan is a little bit more defined, and so that's why people have said a lot of things like it falls under the bi umbrella, and people from the pan community have spoken against that, but more because of a feeling of invalidating, like people being like, oh, pan is bi, which always kind of feels not really great and wonderful. But it makes sense when you're explaining it to someone who doesn't understand what it is, to be like, no, bi is two or more, sometimes all. Pan just really does mean all. Like they're focusing on the all when you're saying pan, because that's kind of what the big movement behind it is, right? Like what it's rooted in is breaking that gender binary and being able to discuss, you know, not just two genders, that there's an ample amount of genders. When you say all, because it really means all, there is an infinite amount of genders out there, and that's what the discussion that you're trying to have when you're talking about pansexuality. So I think that's more of the important thing when it gets down to what pansexuality is or defined as. Yes, the sexual orientation means attracted to all genders, all people, but what it really is it's this rooted thing in wanting to be allied in the movement of being able to break the gender binary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'm kind of getting it. It's that it's more than just a sexual feeling or sexual orientation, but it's also almost an act of solidarity with breaking the gender binary, with standing with like NB people, trans people, that it's not. So in that claim, in that sense, then would you say, and since this is a debate, I think it's appropriate to raise this question, would you say that bisexuality is framing yourself in a heteronormative, cisgendered realm where it's not as progressive or it's not breaking gender bounds?
No, and I think that people have that misconception. That's a misconception that bisexuality deals with all the time. And before we had the LGBT community, it was just the LGBT community. It was just the gays. It was just about sexual orientation. And a community that accepts sexual orientation isn't going to automatically accept different gender identities. And you saw a lot of that when we were starting to see that gender isn't in a binary system, when that was starting to become more relevant, when researchers and scientists were like, oh, there is more beyond this, man and women. There's more than this, and sometimes you're born in one and you can be the other, and this is much more complicated than we originally have perceived it to be. And when that was happening, then we tried to include that in the queer community. The queer community had backlash towards that. The queer community was not kind to our transgender friends. We were not kind to people that were outside of the gender binary. We were mean, and it took a long time, and it took people outside of the community. Pansexuality didn't originate within the LGBT community. It originated outside the community and then was adopted into the community because the community was not accepting. And we sometimes forget that. I think we completely just forget that portion. But when we started to realize that we needed to be more accepting, that this was a real thing, the bi community was right there in 1990, rewriting the bi manifesto and rewriting and making sure that their community stood for what was continuing. So there have been historically terrible things that people from the bisexuality have said, and it has been labeled in a way that was like just cis and just het or just cis people before. But that's because that's how the community was. That's how we thought of things. That's where the science was. That's where society was. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that ignorance is not innocence. I'm not saying that by any means. But that's the reality of it. That's the reality of the situation that they were in, so yes, there has been times where bisexuality was framed in a way that's not kind, but they have taken it as a community and rewrote it as a community and stand for it still today. You still see Jenna here today dealing with the same things that you're talking about. They've been dealing with this since 1990. They've been, since they wrote the Bi Manifesto, they've still had to have these conversations over and over and over again. So I don't think that bi has anywhere is less inclusive or less progressive. It's just, for one, it's history stands in a different place. It's rooted in a different place, right? Its history is rooted in multi-sexualism, which is a totally different topic than where pansexuality was rooted in. And it has progressed. It has been extremely progressive since the research has been founded, since they've gotten new information. As things have become more progressive, they have included that into their sexuality. And I think that we should note that. And one thing we should also note, and that we don't do this as pansexuals, we try and don't say this, but we wouldn't be possible without bisexuality having laid the bricks for us to have our own little movement. Our movement, I'm not saying that diminishes the power of the movement. I'm not saying that it puts any less effort on the people that dealt with these things and pushed these things forward for 50 years, that dealt with the backlash. I'm not saying that takes away any of that, but that wouldn't have been possible without there being some groundwork that you can be multisexual in the first place, which was done by the bi community.
Thank you, Mackenzie. That was a very thorough explanation. You really went off there. Jenna, do you have any?
Hey, babe, ADHD will do it to you.
Hey, now.
That hyperfixation, and I'm here for it. And I clocked it when I saw it. Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, Jenna, is there anything that stood out to you from Mackenzie's bit, or anything that came to your mind that you wanted to talk on from your side or bring to the table?
Yeah, so what's very interesting is that people forget that before Pan was really focusing on really dismantling the gender binary, the bi community had to work on dismantling another binary, the gay straight binary. For a long time, that's all there was. That's all that was accepted. And it took a very long time and a lot of hard work for the bi community to pave their own movement and to pave their own way. Bi erasure is a huge problem going back in history. It's clear that bisexuals have existed as long as gay and straight people, obviously, but the issue is for a long time they were just lumped into the gay movement or the lesbian movement. And it wasn't until like the 60s or 70s where finally we started becoming more progressive in our understanding of how attraction works and how attraction can be fluid. And that was really a necessary thing to happen. And I think for younger people or for people that are coming at it from a very contemporary standpoint, we forget that wasn't always a thing and we take it for granted. Like, oh yeah, of course you can be bi, like duh. But you can't take that for granted. It wasn't always there. We had to make that happen. So the bi community did a lot for expanding our idea of what attraction can be, what is valid attraction, and bi needs to be understood as the fluid identity that it is. For a long time, it encompassed all identities between gay and straight because it's the only label that there was. And it was a very novel thing that you could even be anything besides gay and straight. So when we talk about bisexuality, we need to keep that in a historic framework and remember that even in 2021, when we're defining bisexuality, it's not a thing where it's only two genders. It's not only a thing where you're focusing on a binary system. Because there have been bi people fighting against the gender binary since its origins, and it's something that it's always believed in. It didn't necessarily have the language or the science or the know-how to express what they wanted to accomplish in that area. And thankfully, we've evolved a lot since then, and now we have a lot more language to describe what gender you can be and how you can be attracted to different people, and that's amazing. But yeah, when it comes to bisexuality, it's a spectrum. It includes anyone attracted to more than one gender. It can be regardless of preference. Basically, it's designed to be this expansive, individualized identity. It's always supposed to be that way. It's just that's kind of gotten lost as we've decided to invent more language and do all these newer things. Sometimes that the history gets lost and we forget that that's what was always meant to be. I'm glad that there are people like Mackenzie in the community that are very historically grounded, and they do their research and they understand this because it's very validating to hear. Unfortunately, not everyone is like that. I would, in fact, say the majority of people are not like that, and they just hear bi, and they say bi means two, therefore you're binary, therefore you're outdated, therefore why aren't you pan? And that part really sucks. And I think if we did a better job at researching our history, you would see how cool and how amazing the bi community has always been.
Beautifully spoken, like well put. Take it to a more personal level, because you're talking about the evolution of what bi has become, and how it has become more, I want to say mainstream, but more accepted. But there's still things that you see, I mean, just casually on television when you're watching and someone's like, oh, I'm bi, you know, you get that, oh, stereotypical, bi means just like, what is it? What was the phrase that you always hear? It's just like, bi now, gay later. Or is
Mhm.
it's like, it's a segue into something else. Like it's there is an evolving acceptance for it, but I mean, it's still this very big, I don't just call it what it is, prejudice
Yeah.
within, I mean, the outside community and the inside community. Because I mean, how many times has I have bi friends who have been like, you know, women won't date me because they think I'm going to just sleep with guys, and it's like vice versa. Like just like I said, going back to a personal level, are there any things that you've like faced in your personal life when you've come out as a bi person and had to have like those conversations with like the people in your everyday life?
Yeah. Like I said, I came out when I was 14, and I have been told throughout the years since I was 14 that it was a phase, and that, you know, I'd eventually pick a side or whatever. Some people very close to me said very hurtful things along those lines, said I was doing it for attention, said I was doing it to be different, said I was doing it to be trendy, all these different things. And, you know, I have now been bisexual for the majority of my life, and I am still dealing with those misconceptions. Um, I'm someone who has a partner. I've had the same partner for how many? It's coming up on 11 years. Most people, when they don't know that I'm bi, would look at me and assume one thing about me, and think that, you know, because you're monogamous and because you have the same partner for so long, you picked a side. You're now gay or you're now straight. Um, but I'm not. I've been bi since I was 14. I've always been bi, no matter who my partner has been, no matter if I've been single or whatever. That's who I am, and that's not changing. I think a lot of people's journey involves thinking that they're bi and questioning and then becoming gay. And if that's your journey, like, that's valid too. Unfortunately, when you take that journey and assume that everyone is on that same journey, that's very harmful. And I'm I'm really happy that I'm in a position to be open about myself now and to kind of dispel some of those stereotypes around it. I think we're getting better at understanding that you can be fluid, you can be bi, like, for your whole life. It is a thing. But yeah, unfortunately, that it still happens to me probably on a daily basis if we're going by some of the comments I get on Instagram.
Let's go with that. Let's take it back to that. I really appreciate what you just said, because I mean, it's really important to like end this bi erasure just because someone's in a monogamous relationship with, I mean, with a partner of any certain gender expression. That doesn't take away from their bi identity. So I mean, and we're talking about journeys. Mackenzie, how about yours? How did you get to your pan identity?
I was lucky enough to have somebody in college explain it to me as a historical label and not the experience that many people have, like Jenna has, where it's like, so you actually should be pan because this. That's not the experience that I had, thankfully. Funny enough, we like just talked about this over on my private podcast on my private podcast on my Patreon. We talked about how um my first like GSA meeting ever, they basically were like, we're going to make a big like alphabet letter, like LGBT, then to like describe to us your sexual orientation, and we'll like label it, like we'll give it, like we'll like name it, and we'll give it a letter, and we'll put it on this big alphabet. And I like spoke about how I felt, and I was like, I just like people, I don't really care. And I was like explaining to them, and they like just drew a heart on the board. They were like, I'm just gonna put like a heart. And I was like, cool, like my sexuality is like a heart. That's great. And then for a long time I went by queer because I didn't really understand. I didn't know what word to use. So I went with a queer for a bit. When I first came out, it was bi. When I first came out, I was bi because I didn't have the vernacular that I needed. And then I went by queer because I just didn't know. And fortunate, like I said, to have a person who explained all of these things. So we had a GSA meeting where we basically did like a PowerPoint on the historical meaning of different sexual orientations, like where they stem from and what they mean, kind of sort of ordeal. And it was one of the first times that I had heard about pan. I had talked to, I was the president, this was the vice president that was putting this on. I had talked to the vice president prior to this, and she had explained to me what pan was and was kind of like, I think you might be pan, but like didn't like pressure it on me. It was just kind of like, this is what it means, and like by what you're saying, I feel like you'll resonate with this sort of thing. And so she gave me the information. Then we got to have a meeting, and we talked all about the different orientations, where they came from, and that kind of sent me on a snowball effect of reading a lot of the histories of where these, genders come, or where these sexualities come from, and and I'm not perfect. I have definitely fallen under the whole like misconception of bi and two, especially as a person with a very like analytical brain. You like see bi and you're like, oh, that's like bicycle, like it's a two, like like
my pet peeve.
Same.
I am not a bicycle. I am not exercise equipment.
Not exercise equipment. And like I know that now, thankfully, and have gotten bi advocate friends who have been like, hey, let's read the bi manifesto, let's talk about things, and have been thankful enough to understand now the difference. And I still think it's important, as I said earlier, because they kind of fight two different battles, right? When you're talking about pansexuality, you're fighting this binary, right? This gender binary. But when you're talking about bisexuality, you're talking about the multi-sexual issues, right? And that's kind of the thing, is it's not necessarily how it makes you feel, but how people react to it when you tell them, right? So think about it in that way. Like when a cis het white man asks you what your sexual orientation is, and you have to respond with one, when either or, pan or bi, you are going to get follow-up questions, I promise.
That was definitely leading up into my next question of like, just how many times have you been like asked about your sexuality and you tell someone and they're like, teach me, instead of just like taking the answer and like fucking off,
Yeah.
They're just
Every
like,
time.
explain, because I don't understand it.
Because nobody, you can't, the issue of like not being like straight or gay is still an issue today. Like people still can't wrap their minds around somebody not just being gay or not just being straight. Like that's still something that people are like, I don't know, seems sus. Like,
Mm-hmm.
You know what? It's something that points something out to my head, because for me, and it doesn't make any sense now thinking back on it, and I feel like a lot of like gay people have done the same thing, where they're like, when you come out, like I told my mom I was bi, thinking that would be easier. Like for some reason, this is going to be an easier thing for her to accept, when you're just like listening to what you told me. I'm like, no, it's not easier at all.
No.
Like I can tell someone I'm gay, and they're just like, okay. That's the end of the conversation. Just like, all right, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
I
never the end
typically
of the
get,
conversation when you tell someone.
no,
Sorry.
I get so many weird, you're fine. I get so many weird questions about mathematics that I never know how to answer. Like, so what's your percentage? Are you 70-30? Are you 50-50? Like, do you like, how many times have you done this? How many people have you dated that are like this? And I'm just like, I mean, my attraction is not a math problem, and I can't reduce my attraction to a formula for you or like I don't understand that, but that's typically what I get when I tell people that I'm bi. It's very weird.
And that's still
for everyone who's not bi, stop
asking
who's
that.
everyone who's bi? You stop asking that. People's sexuality is not a fucking bingo card for you to like check off and try to validate for them. It's not your business, babe, you know?
It's not a fucking bingo card.
Yeah, let's not bring math into it. It's too much.
See, I think that's kind of the whole thing, though. Like, I mean, as much as we're making fun of people asking questions, that is the whole thing. Like, when you're asked, like, when they're like, oh, what's your sexual orientation? Me saying pan, I say that because I want you to be like, what do you mean? And for me to be like, I mean, fuck your gender binary system.
Beautiful.
It's like, don't ask me, but I have. It's like what is it, like a catch-22? It's like, I'm tired of being fucking asked, but if I don't get asked, and I don't, like, the information's not being spread accurately.
Exactly. So, like, as annoying as it is, I would rather somebody ask and me get to educate them. And as long as they're receptive of being educated. The second they're like, no, two genders, I'm like, block.
So let's talk. I want to ask about like some of the common misconceptions of pan and bi. So I had seen a video. I think it might have been over the summer. I think it was Josh Elfgott. He described pan, and I'm curious if this is what you guys think. He described pan as being attracted to personality, and more so personality, whereas bi was more of a physical attraction. I believe that's what the gist of it.
What I want to know,
no shade to Josh, by the way.
I have a follow-up question. Is if what are you attracted to then? If you're not attracted to somebody's personality, are all bi people just attracted to dick? Like, that's just they're just like, I like what you look like physically, and that's it. Like, I don't give a fuck what your brain's like. I don't understand that question. Like,
so here's the thing. That video, I remember responding to it because I was very upset, and I continue to be upset with large creators that are in the community that are saying stuff like that. And I know that oftentimes it's not intentional. People make mistakes, and like when it's a simple mistake and you're able to learn from it, like I understand completely. I responded to that video saying that doesn't make sense, and that it's, saying that pan people are attracted to personality while bi people are primarily attracted to gender, whatever that means, or primarily attracted to physical attributes. That actually perpetuates a lot of biphobic stereotypes that we have to deal with, considering, for decades, bi people have been considered to be more sexually deviant, more promiscuous, more untrustworthy, more greedy in our sexual appetites, and like all these different things. And that plays into that. And every time someone tells me that I am reduced to sexual attraction, and that my attraction is not romantic or spiritual or anything else, that hurts, that wounds me deeply. And I commented on that video, and the response I got was not good. It was not receptive. It basically told me that I was wrong, and I unfollowed after that video. I think a lot of work needs to be done with our big creators and the way they speak out on these things. And I just want to be honest. That video, I still think about it sometimes. Like, it really sucked.
I'm sorry, and I'm apologize if that hit a soft spot. I didn't mean to bring that up in any way.
I know I see that stuff every day, so it sucks, but I'm used to it. I shouldn't be. I shouldn't have to be, but yeah, and it's still, it's just bad.
Hey, big creators, if you get a question that you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know, or phone a friend that does assume that identity.
The thing is, people think they do know.
Exactly.
They believe they know more than people who are of that identity. And I believe, if I remember correctly, I mean, we can go back in the comments and I might be miswording things, but I remember, the response was something along the lines of, I studied this in college, therefore I am right. And I was just like, okay, but educational institutions are still outdated and are still, in the way that they present LGBTQ information, and they can still be wrong. Like, oftentimes major institutions or large scale organizations are wrong about bi and pan identities, because there's just not a lot of historical context, and there's not a lot of quality education being done in that area. I think it's getting a lot better, but we're still not where we need to be at all. And I think we need to admit that just because you learned it in college, or just because you got it from, a somewhat bigger, name recognition type source, it doesn't mean that it's true. And I think we have a lot of unlearning of uh, of lies and misconceptions that we need to start doing in order for things to get where they should be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, these
So like
institutions are still very cis heteronormative, right? I mean, the faculty, I mean, it's getting more diverse, I assume, but still all these studies and everything that they've been doing the past 50, 100 years were very white, straight, cisgender. So it makes sense that they might not be fully up to date on these things.
I know there's something else that you said that resonated with me, is something about, just bigger creators. I think sometimes people have a tendency to make themselves like the be all know all of a certain topic, when you're just like, your experience is your experience. Even if you're coming from a certain community, you can't really say with a certain like weight behind you that like this is the experience, when it's like, no, it varies from person to person. you know I think that's something that big creators need to be more aware of, and stop like claiming to be like the end all be all when it comes to queer knowledge.
Yeah, I think we're killing ourselves trying to be the dictionary all the time and trying to be the encyclopedia all the time. Um, I think when we try to unanimously say, this is the meaning of this in all cases, or this is the truth and everything else is not the truth. It's not helpful. And identity, either sexual orientation or gender identity, it it's so individualized. Every person's relationship with their identity is unique, and we can't pin everyone down to this one dictionary definition, or these sets of traits. It's just not how it works, and I know that a lot of people get frustrated by that, because um not having clear cut categories can be confusing. And I think we desire clear cut categories because it helps us make sense of the world, but that's not how it is. And I think once we just start to accept that, and accept that meanings can be fluid, identities can be fluid, and it's fine. Like, we will be okay. People will start to feel better. But yeah, it's hard when people want to categorize and specify everything that they possibly can.
Beautiful. Another question. A lot of this is a lot of figuring out your identity when it comes to being bi and pan, or even just any type of queer person, is a self-discovery kind of thing, because we all go through public school and we're taught normal like heteronormative sex, and that's the only sex that we're taught, so we don't get the chance to figure out or have that like that knowledge given to us. We have to seek it out. But it would change, or like the weight of having an identity or figuring out an identity would change if like the public schools were to teach more about gay sex and lesbian sex and bisex and pansex and the different multitudes of sexuality versus just heteronormative sex that we're forced to learn in public schools.
Yeah,
I don't,
for sure.
I don't know how else you want me to respond to that except for yes. You were
I know,
correct.
yeah, I know that, I'm a teacher, and last year, well, for 7 years I taught middle school, and I started a pride club at my school, an LGBTQ organization for the kids, because I knew that there was a need for that. Um, Kids need information, and I'm sad that it has to be relegated to like an after school activity. I wish it was in the curriculum to talk about LGBTQ issues, and sometimes it is. It depends on your school district for sure. But I mean, in my view, I was like, well, after school is better than nothing, and I definitely tried to like break some of those barriers and break some of those stereotypes. I know like I don't know what kind of health class or sex ed class you guys had in middle school and high school, but I know there was like a time where we were allowed to like write anonymous questions to the teacher and like fold it up and give it to them, and they would like answer our like weird adolescent sex questions and like questions like that. And I did that with my pride club, just not just about like sex stuff, but just about anything related to identity and attraction. And that experience really opened my eyes to how much kids already know and how much they need to be prepared. I think we shelter kids a lot because we think they're kids, like they can't know about being gay, they're just kids. But like they are knowing younger and younger, and they are starting physical and romantic relationships younger and younger. They need the information for sure.
I agree. America, get your shit together.
A common misconception or a common thing thrown out there is that bisexuality or pansexuality, either or, I guess, is transphobic. I mean, I see this more on the bi side because they're saying that bi excludes trans people. Does anyone want to go into that in their respective identities and kind of talk about the inclusion of trans people?
I think that the way that it started for pansexuality was people like wrongfully define pansexuality by saying things like, oh, it's bisexuality but includes trans people, which is just a really weird sentence in general. And it probably shouldn't have been said. And we've mentioned this several times now, but that's what happens when people that don't know what they're talking about talk and define things and say things that they shouldn't be saying, because that's where this is stemmed from, right? But I think that the sentence itself, not a very nice sentence, not a very good sentence. The meaning behind what they were trying to say, I think, is that, like I said earlier, the queer community wasn't very accepting of trans people. We didn't say LGBT until like the late 80s. That's not that long ago. I was born in 92. That is not much older than me that we started saying the LGBT, that we started including trans folks in this space. And we forget that a lot. We try to pretend like we didn't do that. We're like, no, we didn't do that. Like, yes, we did. let's own up to the fact that we weren't nice. The queer community has done some terrible things. The queer community has been racist. The queer community has been incredibly transphobic. Don't shy away from a past because that's bad. Then you look stupid. Then you look like you're trying to hide your ignorance, that you're trying to hide the things that you've done when you should be facing them and as a community dealing with them and trying to be anti those things, right? That's the correct response to having a history that is tumultuous like that, right? So the meaning behind that sentence is that, pansexuality came about in the 70s and 80s outside of the queer community, as a way to include people. Like it originated in most likely the kink scene, right? Like the BDSM scene, where people where transgender people felt more comfortable because the BDS scene was more accepting than the queer scene was. So that's where this, originated from. So when they say things like that, they're saying, it originated in a time where the queer community wasn't really accepting of trans people. So it originated outside to be inclusive, and there's history behind it. But when you word it in that way, when you word it in a way that's like it's bisexuality except it includes trans people, that for one takes away that bisexuality has progressed and has changed and has made the changes, has officially in their manifesto made the correct changes to make sure that their sexuality is staying progressive and staying inclusive. And two, it also makes it sound like trans people are somehow of a different species, of a different variety. So you're not saying a sentence in a very nice way. You could go about it saying something like that as saying pansexuality originated in the 70s, a while ago, when they were trying to beat this gender binary system. They were trying to make it more normal. They were trying to normalize transgender folks. They were trying to normalize this sort of thing. So it kind of came about then, but which helped it become more normalized within the queer community as well, which helped it become more normalized for the bi community. So like there's great things that it did. It's wonderful, but you have to be careful about the way that you say things, because I think the way that some people have said things, especially when they're like speaking out of turn, because a lot of the times I've seen people that define pansexuality in a way that's not very kind, like saying things like hearts not parts, that's weird, saying things like gender blind, that one's super weird, like that's super weird, why do we say that? I see your gender, it doesn't really play effect into if I'm attracted to you or not. So people that and you see those things, you see those words said by people that aren't in the pan community. They're like these are coming from people that are defining it outside the pan community, and then those definitions are progressed forward by the people that we were just talking about, the people that have these big flat platforms and are speaking out of turn. So we've been seeing that continually, right? And things like saying like gender blind, that can be trained into being transphobic very easily. That can sound transphobic very easily to somebody. Saying it includes trans people, it can seem very transphobic. So we're allowing people that don't understand to continue to define things and continue to say things that aren't nice, and we need to stop letting those definitions progress. And it's really, really hard. As a person who tries to do a lot of pan advocacy, it's so hard to be in the comments of every video like, no, shut the fuck up, you don't know what you're talking about. It's so hard because people don't want to, and I'm not nice, I'm not Jenna, I'm not like, hey, I'm gonna kindly explain it to you. I'm not Jenna, I'm like,
nice.
You're fucking wrong. Shut the fuck up and sit down. And so it's hard, but we need to stop letting that continue, right? If we're gonna have, just like we need to stop letting bias to continue, that we need to stop that. Same thing, we need to stop saying things like pan is gender blind and pan includes trans people and things like that. Like we need to stop progressing those things and start having conversations about where they originated from, like we said, what the movements that they're trying to break down, the binaries that they're trying to fight against. But we talk about the good things of these multi-sexual labels. And then on top of that, we need to be talking about how these multi-sexual labels have so many similar experiences in life and would be such an incredible alliance if we could just stop saying things that are not kind to each other.
We think we would learn.
You think we would learn after like 150 years of being a queer community that we would learn to like be nice to each other, but like
I want to jump in really quick because you talked about how the pansexuality originated in like kink and BDSM communities. And I mean, when we talk about how the bi and pan communities have always overlapped, it all starts there because bi people were heavily involved in the BDSM communities too. Some of our most major players as far as bi pioneer activists came from kink communities and also considered themselves pansexual. People like Brenda Howard, who who is bi and is known for creating the very first Pride Parade that ever happened. She was in the kink community. Gigi Raven Wilbur, who is an awesome intersex bi activist, also came from the kink community. And so these communities have always been intertwined. We've always shared experiences, and we've always come from kind of the same place. And I hate that people don't understand that either. Like, people like to act like bi and pan have nothing to do with one another. And like, bi is here and pan is here, and you're bi if you're this and you're pan if you're this, and that's it. And it's like, no, like, people identify as bi and pan. That's been a thing for decades. People are a part of both communities. People go back and forth and flow in between. People go from being bi to pan and pan to bi. Our communities are essentially one, or at least they should be functionally. But we act like they're not. And it really sucks because we are wanting to fight for the same things. We suffer from the same things, as far as being more likely to have mental illness and being more likely to suffer from abuse, more likely to be suffer from sexual assault. Like, there's all these different things that we share, and we could be advocating against together and bring awareness with together. And instead we waste our time fighting with each other. We're not oppressing each other. Like, cishets are oppressing us, not each other. And I think we're missing the mark. We are one, and we should act like it. It's absolutely ridiculous. It just doesn't make sense to me.
No, yeah, and I Jenna's talking about how there was a lot of bi people in the kink community, and that's very wholeheartedly true. And that's because as I said earlier, the kink community was more accepting than the queer community was. They felt so excluded by the queer community. They were like, fuck you guys, I'm gonna go hang out with the kink community then. And they had these much better advocacies and more allies that were like, oh yeah, I hear you, that sounds right, in the freaking kink community. And that's something that we still deal with today as a multi-sexual label, of this like not being enough in a queer space. Ooh, girl, we feel that all the time. Anytime I'm like, that man is so sexy, people are like, I thought you were gay. I'm like, I have been so vocal about being pansexual. They're like, oh, I thought that was like a joke. Like, hee hee. Like, no.
Hee hee.
Hee.
It's so cute to be pan. That's why I say it.
It's like, it's adorable. Like, it's just like it's like a little joke that I play. Because I want to pretend to be attracted to men.
Yeah, it's my favorite thing.
It's my favorite thing. I'm just like, yes.
I just
you
like
think
to,
it's a choice to be attracted to men.
Yes,
you
like,
think it's a choice.
Do we think it's a choice to be attracted to anybody? Like, love is pain.
I think I would be
man.
like, yes.
Period.
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
But also,
that's so
fuck
true.
Men.
I do have to chime in here. I have to chime in here too, though, because I do and I just went off on this on Instagram today. I do get kind of sick of the ew men thing too, because it does have like a kind of biphobic kind of vibe to it. Especially as, for so many bi people who are partnered with men and who prefer to date men, it can feel somewhat invalidating. And I understand the jokes. I do. It's funny from time to time, but I think I get messages from a lot of people who are exhausted by that whole thing. Like, bi women married to men, it can feel kind of bad.
Yeah, that makes sense. I totally see that.
I think that totally makes sense, and it almost comes like a hard thing to balance as a multisexual person when you're attracted to men, but also you're like, but kind of fuck men. Like, you're like, oh, I don't know what line to sit on right now.
Yeah, like,
because it's you don't want to discriminate somebody who's attracted to men, because I'm also attracted to men. I don't want to belittle your attraction or your relationship, but also that you need to have these conversations about how much more frequently, multisexual people are going to experience sexual trauma from men. And it's a huge statistic. And so we need to be having these conversations. So you're like, it's this weird balance that you're supposed to sit in as a multisexual person. That is really hard to manage.
It is hard because there's there's valid criticisms of the patriarchy, obviously. But when those criticisms go into the territory of harming by women, like, then are we really fighting the patriarchy? You know what I mean? So it's a weird line to walk. As you said, it is complicated. I hope people are mindful of like navigating that with a little bit more finesse, instead of just being like, you men, if you have a boyfriend, blah, like, 'cause that, then we're just being rude.
Right. The line I try to skate is, I'm not gonna put you down for liking men, but men, ew, like, not you for liking men, but men, you know what you did. But, no,
You are aware of your transgressions.
Well, that's going on to not a lighter note, but a different note, a more personal note. What's something? This is not on our questions, but I mean, what's been something that's been, freeing, or just like, what have you loved about claiming your identity and owning your identities? Like, what's something that's actually like brought joy into your heart?
I love this question. I think it's so cute, Anthony. You're adorable.
I'm an adorable little cutie.
You are an adorable little cutie. I like I kind of said earlier, the reason I go with pansexual is for it's like fighting the gender binariness. Like, that's the reason that I say it. Like, I want people to be like, what do you mean? And for me to be able to be like, well, this is what I mean, and get to go on like a massive tangent. Like, that's what I'm looking for as somebody who is not in that realm, if that makes sense. Like, I don't fall into the gender non-binary realm, and but I understand it, and I want to be an ally with it, and I want to make sure that I'm validating people and all of that happens, and I want to normalize it so that we can stop saying terrible things that we still continue to say about the gender binary system. And so saying those things and doing that is why I do it, and continuing to do that online and seeing more people kind of coming back from this disclosure, and instead of a year and a half ago, if I posted something about being pansexual on TikTok, it would be slammed with like, you're a transphobe, you're a bi-erasure, fuck you, I'm unfollowing, you're disgusting. And so I've continued to talk about it and try and change that narrative. And now when I post something, I see a lot of like pan pride, like the little pink, yellow, blue, like hearts going up. I hate that flag, but I live with it. I don't get to make the rules of the flag that I have. It's not my choice, whatever. But and so I see the difference of us having these conversations and continuing to have these conversations online, and how that's changing people's perspectives a little bit. So that to me is the validating part. Is yes, we've had to deal with the bullying, but we've continued to kind of stick our ground and educate, and I'm seeing that actually take hold even in our own community. We're starting to be so much more accepting even in our own community. We're like, no, you are valid. your orientation is valid, who you are is valid. And we didn't see that even like 10 years ago, right? Even we invalidated bisexuality 10 years ago. In my first GSA, we were like, oh, you're bi, you're like, as you said, like, oh, almost gay, or like, will be gay soon, like things like that. Like, we still invalidated even bi people then, but now we are becoming so much better at that. We are being so much more accepting from like us older gays, unfortunately, being a little bit more education and saying things and trying and sticking our ground and not just backing down with people having really not that much evidence to it's like a conspiracy theory, like their conspiracy theory of pan and bi being against each other, and all their little pieces of evidence they will drop into your DMs, and their little links of blog posts, and you're like, let's not use blog posts as resources, guys. let's back it on up and use a little bit of historical context, and then have these conversations. And so we're doing that, and we're seeing the outcome of that unfold currently, and that to me feels so validating and just really a prideful moment.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the main things that makes me so happy about fully embracing bisexuality and being open about it online is just so much I've learned. Even though I've been bisexual for more than half of my life, um, there there's always been so much mystery around bi history and bi activism, and like I never learned about it in depth until like the last couple years. And it's because of all of these questions that people started asking me. Like the more I was open about being queer and being bi, naturally people started asking me questions about it, wanting to know information. And I was like, well, if I am on social media and I have this following, I should have the information that they want. Like I should start doing some research, like hardcore research. Not I'm going to go on this Tumblr blog and copy what this person said, but like research articles, like going back in the archives, like serious stuff. And I've taken time to do that for hours and hours, and it's so awesome. Like it's so beautiful to see that there's so much history that I didn't know about and that other people don't know about, and I'm able to tell them about it. And it makes me so happy. I think that's my favorite thing is learning something cool about bisexuality that is shrouded in mystery that nobody's ever talked about for whatever reason, and I'm able to bring light to it, and we're able to start conversations about it, and it helps give context to bi as an identity. And I think that's what we really need is context instead of just seeing bi as a word and making assumptions. So that's been awesome. I love when people want to talk with me about history and just about little tidbits that I learn. It's just so much fun.
It's the most I don't want to say adorable, but it's the most like heartwarming thing to see like both of your faces light up to talk about. Like obviously you're on the right path and you're doing what you love to do. Like because as you talk about it, I can see just that spark of joy behind it. So like first and foremost, thank you for doing the work that you're doing because I mean it has to be done by someone and y'all are out here doing it. So
I mean, yeah, like as you said, it has to be done by someone.
nope.
Yeah. No, like
I
it has.
love how like no one wanted to be like, thank you, take a
No,
compliment.
thank you. No, thank you. And as I think somebody does have to do it. Like we have this discourse has happened, and it's not like we can take a time machine and stop somebody's 2001 Tumblr post that kind of snowballed this whole event. Like we can't just like take your computer away. So we have to kind of deal with it now, And I think as that's having people like Jenna and I that can stand as a bi advocate and as a pan advocate and stand in solidarity and showcase that is what we need to continue to do, right? Is to showcase that they're valid identities, that you are valid in your identity, that it is okay to have, even if it's not pan or bi. Like we haven't necessarily discussed the other multi-sexual labels today, because they do kind of get to fly under the radar, and that's not necessarily fair. And I've said this before, like pan and bi get so much of the highlight because of this discourse, and because because they do have a little bit more historical kind of background. Like pan has an origin story, and so does bisexuality, and then like the multi-sexual labels kind of came in, with the evolution of our identities, and the evolution of multi-sexualism. But there are other multi-sexual labels as well, and those also intersect with bi and sometimes with pan and all of that, and that's all valid. And what we need is to continue to see people with those labels strongly saying them. I think that because of the discourse, I've seen so many people that identified as pan or as bi that like backed up and just started using queer because they were like, I don't want to do this. Like I don't want to have to deal with comments from people saying all these crazy nasty things. So I'm just going to say queer. And that makes me so sad because I wish that we had come together and not done that, been like, no, I'm going to still identify as pan, and I'm going to educate myself and then educate you and why we should not be doing that, because we definitely did that. We bullied people in our own community into changing their identities because we wanted to, because for shits and giggles, like
Yeah, I'm somebody who definitely fell into that category, and I know you spoke about that too, about feeling like you couldn't be the label you wanted to be, and so you just say queer. And I think, I identify as both bi and queer because I like having them both together. I think it's kind of subversive and it makes people annoyed. And I like to layer identities because people don't know you can. And I like to bring awareness to that. It's like, no, you can use multiple labels. You can stack them up as high as you want. You can identify as bi, pan, and queer if you want. Like, there's no rules to this stuff. I talk a lot about reclaiming the word bi because of how negative the discourse has become around it. I do feel like I have to, in a sense, reclaim it because it's seen as such a nasty word in a lot of people's minds, and it's like you have to take it back. You have to take the positive meaning back and give it the narrative that you want. So even though it might be a lot easier for me to just stay being queer and not bi, I think there's an importance in saying, no, I'm queer and I'm bi. And if that makes you uncomfortable, well, you need to learn something. Let's educate ourselves on how that is possible.
I use queer as my scapegoat. I know that's not what you want it to be, but that's what if I don't want to deal with someone's bullshit and they're like, "What's your orientation?" I'm just like, queer. I don't feel like dealing with you. Like,
there's a time and a place to get into a debate with somebody, so I totally understand if you don't have the energy.
yeah, because you know if you answer with pan or bi that you're going to get follow-up questions and all these sorts of things. But if you just say queer, people can like assume whatever they want,
Yeah.
and then you're not going to have follow-up questions. And I know that's like not like I really have spent the past like hour pledging to educate and be more informative. But some days, you know what? Some days I don't want to deal with old white men. I don't.
Most days.
To speak fucking on it. I mean, you both kind of like segued into our next question, which was going to be like how you spoke on how to end that discourse, like this bi versus pan. The whole reason the episode's named this is because I mean, it's an attention grabber. It's what it is people think there's this discourse. I mean, people don't think there is this discourse. So the way you said to end it is that education, and also it's that standing together as a community versus so I think my final question that I have, because I know Ryan might have another one, but how would you, for the young people watching who are still trying to figure out that part of their identity, how would you say, not this is how you figure out if I'm bi or pan, but what do you say as to claiming an identity? What's the importance of it to you, and how could it not benefit them to claim an identity, but like with the freedom that comes in, figuring out who you are and choosing your identity and not sticking by it as in like, this is my identity, but like owning it,
Yeah. Well, first, like, just so anybody that hasn't heard this yet, you don't need a label. Some people, like myself, thrive with having a label. I like need to be organized. I need to be sorted. That's just the need that I have. But not everybody does. Some people don't need a label. Some people don't want a label. You can just say queer or however you want to say it. But if you are searching for something, if you are searching to be sorted, if you're looking to put the gay sorting hat on and be assigned your little gay house,
it's actually the scarf of sexual preference.
That's my favorite thing I've ever heard.
The scarf of sexual preference. Stop. Yeah. If you are looking to put on the scarf of sexual preference, I think just doing a little bit of not even reading about what they are, but where they have historically come from can be really helpful. I think that's what helped me when I was finally choosing like an actual label besides just being like a heart or like queer. I said I had like the historical context given to me by my GSA vice president, and that helped with me being able to, like, oh, this is where I align. Like, this feels right to me. This is what I want to, like, continue to fight against. So, when you're trying to find your label, trying to find your thing, there might not even be one. You might need to, like, make your own, and that's fine too. Like, they're just labels. They're just there to kind of guide you, and again, you have to think about what you want to say when people ask you that question, because that's the time when you're going to use that word, right? Unless you're putting it in, like, your Instagram bio or your, like, dating bio, your, like, dating app bio, like, that's fun too, I guess. But any other time that you're going to use that, like, in actual context, is when you're at, like, a meeting or someplace and somebody says, oh, what's your sexual orientation? Your response is going to be a word, and that's going to progress a whole nother conversation. So that's the portion that you should think about, what word you want to respond with that's going to lead to what conversation that you want to have.
I think the most common question I get on my social media pages is, what am I? Am I bi? Am I pan? Am I omni? All the labels. There's countless labels you can pick from when you like more than one gender, and people don't really know what to do with so many choices sometimes. I think it can be very overwhelming when you're young, and there's a whole vocabulary list that you need to learn. And meanwhile, people are yelling at you and giving you different definitions of what they all mean. And, like, it's very difficult. And so I just want to say, if you're in that situation, and you're feeling overwhelmed, that is absolutely normal. And I would feel overwhelmed if I was in that position too. What I tell people, which can be frustrating to hear, is that there is no right answer. And if you like more than one gender, there are infinite possibilities for what you could call yourself: bi, pan, omni, poly, abrosexual, queer, fluid. Like, there's so many, and they all overlap, and they can all, like, mean different things to different people. And at the end of the day, it's about what word you resonate with, that you want to align yourself with. And if you can't decide, there's no rule that says you have to decide. You can have no label, like Mackenzie said. You can stack labels, which I always advocate for, especially when labels overlap like they do. There is no harm in claiming multiple identities, because they all overlap, and they're also similar anyway. If you resonate with more than one word, that's fine. We're not on opposing teams. You don't have to pick a side, whether it's gender or whether it's bi, pan, omni, poly, any other label. We're in this together, and you can use whatever label works for you. Anyone who tries to tell you you're actually this or you're actually that, no, you're not. Do what you want.
I loved that.
That's beautifully said.
We are not. There's no teams. This is not football or any other those sport thingies that those people play sometimes.
That's hilarious.
This is not football.
I know.
No.
Anthony's final question was kind of my final question. So I guess if you had to give just broad advice,
let's be on the same wavelength.
Period. And if you had broad advice or general advice for anyone listening to this podcast, what would you tell them?
I mean, the one thing that I want to reiterate, I said it kind of already vaguely, but if you identify as pansexual, make sure that when you are explaining that to people, that you're not using language that is by erasure. And I think that we do that very frequently. We like as I said earlier, we forget that there was a road paved for us that we could divert off of. That it wasn't just set up. That we weren't the first multi-sexual sexual orientation to come about, and that. So when you're wording that, make sure you're not saying, like, bi but more progressive or bi but better. Like, then you're effectively kind of pitting yourself against another sexual orientation, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants this like versus thing that we're talking about. What you can do is you can use bi as an example. You can be like, it's similar to bi because people understand bisexuality, right? You can be like, it's similar, it's kind of in the same kind of spectrum as bi. Like, bi is like 2 or more, sometimes all, times like more defined as like really, really all. And you could just be cautious about the words that you are using, because we are, as Jenna said, on the same team. We're playing for the same people. We all want the same goal. We want the same end goal. We just be nice to each other and use language that is kind and inclusive when you're defining stuff. And that goes not just for people that identify as pansexual. If you don't identify as pansexual and are identifying it for somebody else, please be cautious of the language that you use on our behalf, because sometimes that language isn't very nice, and we need to stop doing that.
Agreed.
Jenna, you're muted.
Sorry. I saw you, and I was like, this is a good point.
I never mute. Why did I do that? Anyway, must have been a mistake. My message to the bi community and like how they can be better allies to pan people is like, first of all, I understand where bi people are coming from when they're feeling defensive. When you hear some of the things, like Mackenzie said, when people are incorrectly defining bisexuality when explaining their own pansexuality, that can make you feel defensive, and it can make you want to go into attack mode. And I get that. However, that is a feeling, and acting out on those feelings is not always in our best interests. We can have that feeling and feel a little bit defensive and feel a little bit, like we want to attack. Instead, we should sit on that feeling and think about why we feel so defensive. How can we start a dialogue with people who are talking like that, to try and bridge the gap of understanding and to try and like correct those errors that people make? Because I think when we just go into attack mode because we're feeling hurt, and we're feeling erased and stuff, it ends up just creating this animosity and this toxic environment that hurts not only bi people, but pan people and anyone attracted to more than one gender. And we can't be creating that animosity, because bi and pan and multi-sexual people already have such a hard time finding safe spaces. We need to keep our spaces safe. And if we're being toxic, that it's not good for anybody. We're just exacerbating the problems that we have. And I always think about this quote that Robin Oakes said. Robin Oakes is an awesome bi activist. She's credited with, having the most popularly used definition of bisexual. She does so much work for our community, and she does identify as bi and pan. Fun fact, not many people know that. She's just a badass. But anyway, this quote, she says, "I sincerely hope that we refrain from responding to our own hurt and erasure by inflicting pain on other marginalized people. Rather, let us understand the dynamics and systems of oppression that can cause this pain, work to challenge and dismantle those systems, and heal ourselves and support others who have been harmed." I think that sums it up perfectly.
That was beautiful. That was
Beautiful.
beautiful.
Great job.
That applies to just so many aspects of just being a part of marginalized groups. I think we've had the conversation on this podcast multiple times about just being like the intersectionality of being like Black and queer, or this and that. Like the infighting is this is what they want. They want us to fight each other versus to turn around and put that shit towards them, which is where the energy needs to be focused on. Imagine if the same energy was being used to dismantle the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Right.
We were going into just fighting each other.
Yeah. And for the multi-sexual labels, instead of fighting against each other, we could be trying to include or encourage the queer community to be more accepting of all of us. We're a subdivision of this community, and we're the small portion of it, and we're fighting each other. Like, what do you mean? Like, we came together as a group of people that experience a lot of similar things, like the promiscuous thing, the can't make a decision thing, the not enough thing, all of those things. We all experience them together as people under this multi-sexual spectrum. So we should be together to fight against that, to make the space that we're in, the queer space in general, more inclusive. And then from there we can join up with the queer space and fight the patriarchy and do all the sorts of things. But we need to stop fighting against each other.
Well, I think that about sums up this podcast. I think we had a great discussion here. I think there was a lot to unpack, and I think our listeners will find a lot of value. So thank you two for being here.
Yes, thank you guys so much. This was so much fun. I'm glad we did this. I'm glad we finally squashed this whole discourse.
For the people who came into this listening, hoping for just like a pure argument, like going back and forth. I bet you don't even right now.
I
really appreciate it.
Somebody was waiting for Jenna and I to start calling each other names. There was somebody listening to this that was like, when are they gonna start being like, you bitch, like that? You know it.
Yeah,
somebody was
people really don't. People don't think it can happen. People are like, you can't talk. Bi and pan people cannot talk to each other. It's like, okay,
there's no such thing as civil conversations. We don't do those.
You guys came across the aisle on a bench that's already connected. Like there's no aisle. You're sitting in the same seat, and I appreciate the professionalism, the calm, cool collectiveness of it all, and just the information.
If you guys want to shout out your socials where people can find you one more time.
Yeah, so I'm j.tk at TikTok and Instagram.
And I'm Mackenzie, spelled the same way it is on the screen. But if you're listening to this episode, it's McKensea. Pretty much everywhere on Instagram, there is an underscore in front of it because some bitch stole my username.
Do you have any questions from the live stream?
No, I just put up these cute little hearts. We got the bi and the pan little hearts.
Yes, we love that.
I love that. That's super cute. Though I still hate those colors. I did them today though. Nice. I did my makeup. I'm inspired by it, but I don't like the colors. If I had gotten to pick the pan flag, it would have been much different. But can't have everything I want, right?
I think it's cute. It reminds me of like summer. Like it's just so bright and happy. Yeah. Yellow's my favorite color though, so that's coming from that place.
Yeah. That's cute. I love that.
Again, thank you both so much for coming. We can't wait to have you back on again at some point.
Thank you all for listening. Thank you
everyone listening. I hope everyone learned something. And if you have questions, find Jenna and I especially on the Instagram. I feel like the Instagram is the spot to spot us for us to answer questions like along these lines. I do make videos on the topic on TikTok. So does Jenna, obviously. But TikTok's kind of more convoluted to answer your questions. It's much easier to answer your questions with resources on Instagram. So
absolutely 100% agree.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.